The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty courtyard of Forward Operating Base Delta as Maria Santos swept the floor of her small salon. At 28 years old, she had been cutting hair for military personnel for 3 years, but nobody on the base really knew her story. To the soldiers, she was just the quiet woman who trimmed their hair before they went out on missions. They had no idea that before she picked up scissors, Maria had been one of the most skilled combat medics in the Army. Maria had grown up in a small town in Texas where her father ran a barbershop. She learned to cut hair as a teenager, helping him after school. When she turned 18, she joined the Army with dreams of serving her country. Her quick thinking and steady hands made her a natural medic. She completed advanced medical training and was assigned to combat units where she saved dozens of lives during firefights. But everything changed during a mission in Afghanistan 2 years earlier. Maria's unit was providing medical support to a reconnaissance team when they were ambushed. An improvised explosive device killed 3 of her closest friends and left Maria with injuries that ended her combat career. The doctors said her left hand would never have the precise control needed for emergency medical procedures. The military offered her an honorable discharge, but Maria refused to leave. She requested assignment to support roles, eventually finding herself at this remote base cutting hair. The base commander, Colonel Richards, had initially been skeptical about having a former combat medic working as a hairdresser. But Maria proved her worth in ways beyond her assigned duties. She treated minor injuries for soldiers who didn't want to report to the medical bay. She listened to their problems and fears. Most importantly, she kept her ears open and often provided valuable intelligence about enemy movements that locals mentioned during casual conversation. On this particular morning, Maria noticed unusual activity around the base. Helicopters had been coming and going all night, and she could see tension in the faces of the soldiers who came for haircuts. Master Sergeant Johnson, a veteran Navy SEAL who regularly visited her salon, sat down in her chair looking more serious than usual. "Rough night?" Maria asked as she began trimming his hair. Johnson nodded grimly. "Lost contact with Team Bravo yesterday evening. They were on a reconnaissance mission about 40 miles northeast of here. Should have checked in 12 hours ago." Maria's hands continued their steady work, but her mind was racing. She knew that losing contact with a SEAL team meant serious trouble. These were not ordinary soldiers who might simply have radio problems. "Any idea what happened?" she asked quietly. "Intel suggests they might have been compromised. Satellite imagery shows increased enemy activity in that sector. We're planning a rescue mission, but it's complicated. The terrain is rough, and we don't know exactly where they are." As Johnson spoke, Maria remembered something important. 3 days earlier, an elderly Afghan man had come to the base selling vegetables. While she was cutting his grandson's hair, he had mentioned increased Taliban movement near an old Soviet bunker complex in the mountains. He had seemed frightened and kept looking over his shoulder as he spoke. "Sergeant Johnson," Maria said carefully, "there might be something you should know." She told him about the conversation with the vegetable seller. Johnson listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "This bunker complex, did he say exactly where it was?" Maria nodded and described the location as best as she could remember. Johnson immediately stood up, his haircut only half finished. "I need to report this to the colonel right away. Maria, this information could be exactly what we need." Within 30 minutes, Colonel Richards arrived at the salon with several other officers. Maria repeated everything she could remember about the conversation. The intelligence officer pulled up satellite maps and asked her to point out the general area the old man had described. "This matches our suspected zone," the intelligence officer said. "If the SEALs are being held in this bunker complex, it explains why we lost radio contact. Those old Soviet structures were built to block communications." Colonel Richards looked at Maria with new respect. "You might have just given us the break we needed to bring our people home." As the officers left to plan the rescue mission, Maria felt a familiar surge of purpose that she hadn't experienced since leaving combat duty. She had always believed that every soldier had a role to play, no matter how small it seemed. The rescue mission was scheduled for the following night. Throughout the day, Maria watched as the base prepared. Special operations teams checked their equipment. Helicopters were fueled and armed. Medical teams prepared for possible casualties. The tension was thick in the air. That evening, Maria was closing up her salon when she overheard two soldiers talking outside. The rescue mission had been delayed because of bad weather, and there were concerns that the enemy was moving the captured SEALs to a different location. Time was running out. Unable to sleep, Maria walked around the base perimeter. She found herself thinking about the captured SEALs and their families back home, who were probably sick with worry. She thought about her own friends who had died in that ambush 2 years ago. Most of all, she thought about the old man who had trusted her enough to share information that might save American lives. As she walked, Maria noticed lights in the distance, coming from the direction of the mountains where the bunker complex was located. They were small and intermittent, like vehicle headlights moving along a mountain road. She immediately ran to the command center and reported what she had seen. The officer on duty called Colonel Richards, who arrived within minutes. Using night vision equipment, they confirmed that vehicles were indeed moving in the target area. This suggested that Maria's intelligence about the enemy moving the prisoners might be accurate. "We can't wait for the weather to clear," Colonel Richards decided. "We need to move now." The rescue mission launched 2 hours before dawn. Maria stood on the flight line watching the helicopters disappear into the darkness, carrying 30 elite soldiers toward what could be either a successful rescue or a deadly trap. As the sun rose, Maria returned to her salon but found it impossible to focus on work. She kept thinking about the mission and wondering if her information had been accurate. What if she had been wrong? What if the old man had been mistaken about the location? The doubt gnawed at her throughout the morning. Around noon, she heard helicopters returning. Maria ran outside and saw medical teams rushing toward the landing zone. Her heart sank, thinking the worst had happened. But as she got closer, she heard cheering from the soldiers gathered around the helicopters. The mission had been a success. All 4 captured SEALs had been rescued alive, though they were injured and exhausted. The bunker complex had indeed been the right location, and Maria's intelligence had been crucial in planning the assault. Colonel Richards found Maria in the crowd and pulled her aside. "Those men are alive because of you," he said. "Your information allowed us to locate them before they were moved to a more heavily defended position." But the celebration was short-lived. As the rescued SEALs were being treated in the medical bay, intelligence teams were analyzing captured documents and equipment from the bunker complex. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the command structure. The enemy had been planning a massive attack on the base itself. The captured SEALs had stumbled onto final preparations for an assault that was scheduled to begin the following day. According to the captured plans, over 60 Taliban fighters were already positioned around the base, waiting for the signal to attack. The base's defenses were strong, but they had been designed to repel smaller raids, not a coordinated assault by such a large force. Worse, the enemy had detailed intelligence about the base layout, guard schedules, and defensive positions. Someone had been providing them with inside information for weeks. Emergency meetings were called as officers tried to figure out how to defend against an attack that was less than 12 hours away. The base could call for reinforcements, but the nearest friendly forces were hours away. They could evacuate non-essential personnel, but that would take time and resources that might be better used for defense. As Maria listened to the urgent radio chatter and watched soldiers preparing defensive positions, she realized that her role as a simple hairdresser was about to change dramatically. The base was about to face its greatest test, and everyone would need to contribute however they could. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Maria stood on the wall looking out at the darkening landscape. Somewhere out there, dozens of enemy fighters were preparing to attack her home and the people she had come to care about. Tomorrow would test everything she had learned as a soldier and everything she had become as a person. She thought about the captured SEALs recovering in the medical bay, alive because information had reached the right people at the right time. She thought about the old man who had risked his safety to warn them about enemy movements. Most of all, she thought about the friends she had lost and the promise she had made to never stop fighting for her fellow soldiers. As darkness fell completely, Maria made her way back to her quarters to prepare for what could be the longest night of her life. The attack was coming, and despite being just a hairdresser, she was determined to be ready for it. The base fell into an uneasy quiet as soldiers took their positions and waited for dawn. In a few hours, Maria Santos would discover that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by those who seek them, but by those who never expected to find themselves in the fight of their lives. The first explosions came just before dawn, shattering the morning silence and sending shockwaves through the sleeping base. Maria jolted awake in her quarters as mortar rounds began falling inside the perimeter. She could hear the sharp crack of rifle fire mixed with the deeper boom of rocket-propelled grenades. The attack had begun earlier than expected. Grabbing her medical kit and the pistol she was authorized to carry, Maria rushed outside into chaos. Soldiers were running to defensive positions while others helped evacuate wounded personnel from damaged buildings. The enemy had clearly studied the base layout carefully, targeting communication centers and defensive positions with their opening barrage. Colonel Richards's voice crackled over the base-wide communication system. All personnel to defensive positions. This is not a drill. We are under heavy attack from multiple directions. Maria ran toward the medical bay to offer assistance, but a massive explosion near the main gate knocked her to the ground. When she looked up, she saw that the medical facility had taken a direct hit. Smoke poured from the building, and she could hear screams from inside. Without hesitation, Maria rushed into the damaged medical bay. The scene inside was devastating. Medical equipment was destroyed, and several medics were trapped under debris. The base's head physician, Dr. Patterson, was unconscious with blood streaming from a head wound. Two other medics were trying to treat multiple casualties while their own facility fell apart around them. "Maria!" Sergeant Wilson called out when he saw her. "Thank God you're here. We need every trained medic we can get." Maria's combat medical training kicked in immediately. Despite her injured hand, she began triaging casualties and coordinating treatment efforts. The years of cutting hair had actually helped her regain much of the fine motor control she thought she had lost forever. As she worked, Maria could hear the battle intensifying outside. Radio chatter indicated that the enemy had surrounded the entire base with approximately 60 fighters, just as the captured documents had warned. They were attacking from 3 sides simultaneously while blocking the main evacuation route. The attack was more sophisticated than anyone had expected. The Taliban fighters were using military tactics and equipment that suggested professional training. They had mortars, heavy machine guns, and what appeared to be military-grade communication equipment that allowed them to coordinate their assault effectively. "We're losing the east wall," came a report over the radio. "They've breached the outer perimeter and are advancing on the communication center." Maria realized that if the communication center fell, the base would be cut off from outside help. The nearest friendly forces were still hours away, and without radio contact, they wouldn't even know the base was under attack. As she treated a soldier with shrapnel wounds, Maria overheard a conversation between two officers. The enemy attack was being led by a Taliban commander known as the Ghost, a former Afghan military officer who had defected and taken his knowledge of American tactics with him. He had been planning this attack for months, using intelligence gathered from local informants. The situation became even more desperate when Maria learned that the base's heavy weapon systems had been sabotaged during the night. Someone had damaged the main defensive guns and disabled several vehicles. The insider who had been feeding information to the enemy had struck again, leaving the defenders with only small arms and limited ammunition. By mid-morning, the medical bay had become a trauma center, treating dozens of wounded soldiers. Maria found herself serving as both medic and coordinator, helping to organize the medical response while treating the most seriously injured personnel. Her steady hands and calm demeanor under pressure reminded everyone why she had been such an effective combat medic. The breakthrough moment came when Maria was treating a wounded communications specialist. As she worked on his injuries, he mentioned that he had been trying to repair a damaged radio when he noticed something strange. The enemy seemed to know exactly when and where the defenders would move, as if they were monitoring internal communications. "It's like they can hear everything we're saying," the specialist whispered. "Every time we plan a counterattack, they're ready for us." Maria's mind raced as she processed this information. She remembered her conversation with the old vegetable seller and how nervous he had seemed. What if the enemy wasn't just getting information from an insider? What if they had been monitoring communications for weeks? She shared her suspicions with Colonel Richards when he came to check on the medical bay. The colonel's face darkened as he realized the implications. If the enemy could monitor their communications, every defensive plan was compromised before it could be implemented. We need to assume they're listening to everything, Colonel Richards decided. From now on, all tactical communications will be face-to-face only. The change in communication protocol immediately began to shift the balance of the battle. Without advanced knowledge of defensive movements, the Taliban fighters found themselves facing unexpected resistance. The base defenders were able to mount several successful counterattacks that pushed the enemy back from key positions. But the enemy adapted quickly. The Ghost began using more aggressive tactics, sending small groups of fighters to probe for weaknesses while keeping the main force positioned for a final assault. The battle was becoming a deadly game of chess, with both sides trying to outmaneuver the other. Maria continued working in the medical bay, but she also found herself serving as an intelligence coordinator. Her years of listening to soldiers and remembering details made her valuable for tracking enemy movements and patterns. She noticed that the attacks were following a specific timing pattern, with major assaults coming at precise intervals. "They're following a schedule," she told Colonel Richards. "Every major attack has come exactly 45 minutes apart. The next one should be in 10 minutes. Her prediction proved accurate. The enemy launched another coordinated assault precisely when she had calculated, but this time the defenders were ready. Machine gun nests that had been repositioned during the quiet period caught the attackers in deadly crossfire. As the day progressed, Maria realized that her unique position gave her insights that the military officers might miss. She had spent months listening to conversations, observing patterns, and building relationships with both soldiers and local civilians. This knowledge was proving crucial in understanding enemy tactics and motivations. The turning point came in the afternoon when Maria remembered another conversation from weeks earlier. A local interpreter had mentioned that Taliban fighters in the area always retreated to a specific valley when they needed to resupply or regroup. The valley was only accessible through a narrow pass that could be easily defended or blocked. "If we could get word to the incoming reinforcements," Maria suggested, "they could position themselves to cut off the enemy retreat route." The problem was that all radio communications were still compromised. The enemy would hear any messages sent to the reinforcements. But Maria had an idea. She remembered that the old man who sold vegetables had a nephew who worked as a driver for the local government. He might be able to carry a message without arousing suspicion. Colonel Richards was initially skeptical about trusting local civilians with critical military information. But as the situation grew more desperate, he agreed to Maria's plan. A coded message was prepared and given to a trusted Afghan interpreter, who would pass it to the driver during his regular supply run. The plan worked perfectly. 2 hours later, the incoming reinforcements had received the message and positioned themselves to block the valley exit. When the Taliban fighters eventually tried to retreat, they found themselves trapped between the base defenders and the blocking force. The final phase of the battle was swift and decisive. Caught between two forces with no escape route, most of the enemy fighters surrendered. The Ghost and a small group of his most loyal followers fought to the end, but they were overwhelmed by superior firepower and tactics. As the sun set on what had been the longest day in the base's history, Maria found herself exhausted but alive. The medical bay was filled with wounded soldiers from both sides, and she worked alongside other medical personnel to treat everyone who needed care, regardless of which uniform they wore. The battle was over, but Maria knew that the real work was just beginning. The base had to be rebuilt, the wounded had to recover, and the intelligence about enemy infiltration had to be investigated. The captured Taliban fighters would be questioned to learn more about their organization and plans. Colonel Richards found Maria as she was finishing treatment of the last wounded prisoner. "I've been talking to headquarters about what happened here today," he said. "They want to know everything about how you helped coordinate the defense." Maria looked around the damaged medical bay, thinking about the soldiers who had lived through the attack, because information had reached the right people at the right time. She thought about the old man who had risked his life to provide warnings, and the driver who had carried messages through enemy territory. "It wasn't just me," she said quietly. "Everyone did their part. Sometimes the smallest pieces of information can make the biggest difference." But even as the base celebrated its survival, Maria sensed that something was still not right. The attack had been too well coordinated, too perfectly timed. The enemy had known too much about base operations and defensive capabilities. The real test would be determining how deeply enemy intelligence had penetrated their operations. As night fell, Maria realized that while they had won this battle, the war was far from over. The ghost was dead, but the intelligence network that had fed him information was still out there. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers that none of them could yet imagine. The investigation into the intelligence leak began immediately after the battle ended. Maria found herself at the center of the inquiry, not as a suspect, but as one of the few people who had noticed patterns that others had missed. Her years of quiet observation and careful listening had given her insights that proved crucial to understanding how the enemy had penetrated base security. Counterintelligence specialists arrived from headquarters within 24 hours of the attack. They interviewed every person on the base, examined communication records, and analyzed the captured Taliban equipment for clues about how intelligence had been gathered. What they discovered shocked everyone involved in the investigation. The leak wasn't coming from a single traitor as everyone had assumed. Instead, the enemy had built a sophisticated network of information gathering that included surveillance equipment, compromised communication channels, and multiple human sources both inside and outside the base. The Ghost had been running an intelligence operation that was far more complex than anyone had imagined. Maria's role in uncovering this network began when she remembered a conversation from several weeks earlier. A local contractor who did maintenance work on the base had mentioned seeing unusual electronic equipment in the mountains. At the time, it had seemed like casual conversation, but now Maria realized it might have been the location of enemy surveillance equipment. He said the equipment looked like communication gear, Maria told the investigators, but it was in a place where no legitimate radio stations would operate. The intelligence team immediately dispatched a reconnaissance mission to the location Maria described. What they found confirmed her suspicions. Hidden in a mountain cave was sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment capable of monitoring radio communications across the entire region. The equipment was American-made, suggesting it had been captured or purchased through illegal channels. But the discovery of the surveillance station raised even more troubling questions. The equipment was too advanced for typical Taliban operations, and it had been professionally installed with backup power systems and weatherproofing. This suggested involvement by a more sophisticated organization with access to military-grade technology and expertise. As the investigation continued, Maria's unique perspective proved valuable in ways she never expected. Her conversations with local civilians had given her insights into social networks and relationships that the intelligence specialists had missed. She knew which families were connected to which businesses, which drivers traveled which routes, and which interpreters had access to specific types of information. The breakthrough in the case came when Maria remembered something that had seemed insignificant at the time. 3 months earlier, a new interpreter had started working on the base. He was highly recommended and seemed competent, but Maria had noticed that he asked unusually detailed questions about base operations during casual conversations with soldiers. He was always very interested in schedules, Maria told the investigators. Guard rotations, supply deliveries, when different units would be training. At the time, I thought he was just trying to be helpful. The investigators immediately focused on the interpreter, whose name was Rahman. A thorough background check revealed that Rahman's credentials were partially fabricated. While he was indeed a local resident with language skills, he had connections to Taliban sympathizers that had been carefully concealed during his hiring process. When confronted with the evidence, Rahman initially denied everything. But when investigators showed him surveillance footage of his meetings with Taliban representatives, he broke down and confessed. He had been recruited months earlier and had been providing detailed information about base operations in exchange for payments and threats against his family. Rahman's confession led to the discovery of 3 other compromised individuals working on the base in various capacities. A cleaning contractor had been photographing documents and equipment. A driver had been reporting on troop movements and supply schedules. Even a cook had been gathering information about personnel numbers and meal schedules that could be used to plan attacks. The scope of the intelligence operation was staggering. The enemy had been gathering information for over 6 months, building detailed knowledge of base operations that had made their attack devastatingly effective. If not for the early warning provided by the vegetable seller and Maria's ability to recognize patterns, the attack would have been completely successful. But Maria's contributions to base security didn't end with the investigation. Colonel Richards recognized that her unique combination of medical training, intelligence gathering skills, and local knowledge made her valuable for preventing future security breaches. He recommended her for a special position that would combine her haircutting duties with formal intelligence responsibilities. The proposal was initially met with skepticism at headquarters. The idea of a hairdresser serving as an intelligence coordinator seemed unconventional. But the success of Maria's contributions during the attack and investigation convinced military leadership to approve the unusual arrangement. Maria's new role allowed her to continue providing personal services to soldiers while formally reporting intelligence information to base security. Her salon became an unofficial intelligence hub where soldiers could share observations and concerns in a relaxed environment. Many personnel felt more comfortable discussing sensitive information during a haircut than during formal debriefings. The position also allowed Maria to expand her network of local contacts in ways that would support base security. She began building relationships with other civilian contractors, local business owners, and community leaders who could provide early warning about potential threats. 6 months after the attack, the base had been completely rebuilt with enhanced security measures. The new defensive systems incorporated lessons learned from the enemy assault, including better communication security, improved surveillance capabilities, and more sophisticated background checking procedures for all civilian personnel. Maria's salon was rebuilt as well, but with a special secure communication system that allowed her to report intelligence information immediately. The new facility included private consultation areas where sensitive conversations could take place without being overheard. The transformation in Maria's role reflected a broader change in how military leadership viewed intelligence gathering. The attack had demonstrated that valuable information could come from unexpected sources, and that seemingly minor observations could have major strategic importance. 1 year after the attack, Maria received formal recognition for her contributions to base security. She was awarded the Civilian Service Medal, the highest honor that can be given to non-military personnel serving with armed forces. The ceremony was attended by the rescued SEALs, whose lives had been saved by her initial intelligence about the bunker complex. During the ceremony, Colonel Richards spoke about Maria's unique contributions to base operations. Sometimes the most important intelligence comes not from sophisticated technology or professional spies, but from people who pay attention to details and care enough to speak up when something seems wrong, he said. The rescued SEALs also spoke about Maria's role in their survival. Master Sergeant Johnson, whose haircut had been interrupted by the first intelligence report, presented Maria with a special commendation from his unit. "You proved that every person serving with our military, regardless of their official role, can make a difference in bringing our people home safely," he said. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The old man who had provided the original warning about enemy movements attended the ceremony with his grandson. Through an interpreter, he thanked Maria for listening to his concerns and taking action that had saved many lives. "In our culture, we believe that courage comes in many forms," he said. "Sometimes the greatest bravery is shown not by those who seek battle, but by those who stand ready to help when help is needed most." As Maria looked around the ceremony at the faces of soldiers who had survived the attack, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a combat medic who lost her career to injury, became a hairdresser who seemed to have found a quiet role away from danger, and had ultimately discovered that her true calling was combining all of her skills in service of others. The attack on the base had tested everyone's courage and capabilities, but it had also revealed that valuable contributions could come from the most unexpected places. Maria had proven that intelligence gathering wasn't just about advanced technology or professional training, but about building relationships, paying attention to details, and having the courage to act on information that might save lives. In the months that followed, Maria's story became a case study taught at military intelligence schools. Her combination of medical training, language skills, cultural knowledge, and interpersonal abilities demonstrated the value of diverse perspectives in security operations. But for Maria herself, the most important outcome was much simpler. She had found a way to continue serving her country and protecting her fellow soldiers, even after her combat career had seemed to end. The base hairdresser had become something much more significant. proving that every person has unique capabilities that can make a difference when applied with courage and dedication. The salon that had once seemed like a quiet retreat from military service had become the heart of the intelligence network that helped keep everyone safe. Maria Santos had shown that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons, but with information, relationships, and the willingness to listen carefully to what others have to say. Years later, when new soldiers arrived at the base and visited Maria's salon for their first haircut, they would hear stories about the hairdresser who had helped save captured SEALs and defended the base against overwhelming odds. Many would initially be skeptical about such an unlikely hero story, but they would quickly learn that at this base, everyone understood that courage and capability could be found in the most unexpected places.